Canadian journalist Peggy Watt was my grandmother, the inspiration for my work as a filmmaker. Abandoned by her parents, Peggy was raised an orphan in Loretto Abbey, a smoke-blackened convent in Toronto's Lakeshore Factory District. In the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, her future was bleak. In nearby New England, girls as young as 10 were recruited to work in the textile mills. As she would all her life, Peggy had her own ideas. She applied to the Royal Conservatory of Music down the street, dreaming of being the first woman to play the piano with the Toronto Symphony, before she saw the notice that women need not apply. But she had excelled at so many subjects, the nuns advised her to become a journalist, where women at least had an outside chance. Then, to her great good fortune, she met a small-town journalist, Balmer Watt, who was setting out to establish a weekly paper on the western frontier. It was love at first sight, with both the man and the idea. Little did she know that one day in Alberta, their work would lead to the first Pulitzer Prize awarded outside the United States. When she set out on the 6-day journey west, Peggy felt a stranger at the edge of history. On the frontier, newspapers were being bought up by the big Eastern chains, but she and Balmer were convinced they could be the exception. They would call the paper the Saturday News. With her son Frederick at her side, she tried to imagine what lay ahead. Balmer had gone before her to find a second-hand printing press. Published once a week, the paper's goal was to provide an independent voice for the frontier community. But as he and Peggy were to discover, the territories were still under the thumb of Ottawa, essentially a colony of the federal government. In her first columns, Peggy tried to imagine the last best West that lay ahead.
If I was asked to describe my first impressions of the West, I would lay great stress on the heroic element. The fresh hours of dawning are very precious in this new land, where every moment counts. It's so good to see people so early astir, so thoroughly in earnest to make good, that the day is all too short for the work planned out.
To understand the challenge Peggy faced, I went on Zoom to talk with journalists who face the same issues today. I started with Linda Goyette, an author of social histories, and once a reporter with the Edmonton Journal.
The pressure on her would be, if she wanted to work for a newspaper, she would be driven into what were then called the women's pages or the society pages, or she would have been writing obituaries. She would have been writing about ladies' teas and what they wore at the ladies' tea. And honestly, when I started in the 70s, it was the same damn thing. They used to call it the life section, but I would call it the death section. It felt like death to me.
I also contacted an old friend, William Thorsell, former editor of the Globe and Mail, who had begun his career in Alberta. The province was to come under extreme attack in the 1930s by the forces of fascism.
Balmer Watt was on the front lines because that was the most aggressive attack on traditional freedoms of the press, which include two major areas. One is the freedom of opinion. The other one is the accuracy and completeness of news reporting. Those things, of course, were under attack in Germany at the time and fascist states, but We were in North America.
As Balmer prepared to publish the first issue of the Saturday News from a trapper's cabin, he could have no idea of the critical role he would play in the future of the province. But now, with only $5 left in his pocket, he set about learning the basics of operating a one-man press. Peggy learned that a special private car had been attached to the train. Liberal Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier was coming to Alberta for the inauguration ceremony, but the federal government had decided not to grant Alberta control over natural resources like oil and gas.
How will I remember the long trip out, sitting day after day, gazing out at the dead-level, desolate prairie. Across from me sat a boy, a face intensely, oh so intensely, enjoying the situation. There was no looking backward. All life lay before him, yet as I now realized, half of mine I had left behind.
When I set out to make films in 1969, Peggy's journey west stayed with me. Did she know that she was joining a settler society that had disrupted an Indigenous way of life, stealing a land that belonged to others?
Here the water was pure, the skies alive with wings, the land abundant with four-footed creatures. Old wise men spoke of the death of their customs and freedom, when their children's children would wear the strange white man's clothing. When the land would be destroyed, when from the sky iron geese would throw their shadows to earth.
Oh, Dad had a sense of adventure. The West was the young man's thing. He came first. And then Mother and Ted came along behind. When she got off the train and Daddy met her, they walked out on the wooden sidewalk on the south side. She looked around and she said, "If you think I'm going to stay in this dump, you've got another think coming." And of course, eventually, anyone that didn't like Edmonton wasn't worth mentioning. She was passionately fond of it. They both were.
I think in the case of Peggy and Balmer, context is really kind of extraordinary. Because when they came to Edmonton in 1905, to stay for 2 weeks, and stayed for 50 years, they came to an environment that really wasn't ready for the speedy development of newspapers and press. There was very little there at that time. They really had tremendous persistence and built it from the ground up.
Edmonton already had a weekly newspaper, The Bulletin, published by the town's most influential citizen, Frank Oliver.
I feel like I know Frank Oliver personally because I've been wrestling with that guy for a long, long time. But he was a very, very powerful man by 1905, a senior Liberal, probably the most powerful Liberal in Western Canada, very much attached to the Laurier government. He became a cabinet minister, Minister of the Interior, and his paper was the major paper in town.
Within days, they realized it would be an uphill struggle. A frontier newspaper would never be free of politics. The fate of the new province would be decided by who controlled the news.
It was a dusty prairie town with lots of problems and lots of hopes and dreams.
It's hard to overstate how important newspapers were to people living in the colonies. Many individuals living across North America had made that journey across the Atlantic Ocean. They left homes behind, and they were desperate to know what was happening in England and the areas around where maybe some of their family were still living. And newspapers were a bit of a lifeblood because it was really the only way, save letters from people back home, that anyone knew what was happening.
I go back to the context in which they started and think to myself, would I have thought, oh, I'll just give up that train ticket back to Brantford, beautiful Brantford with those nice big trees and everything, and stay here on the North Saskatchewan and try to take whatever savings I've got, money I can raise, and start a weekly. Other people went to Alberta and looked around and saw nothing, and in Peggy and Balmer's case, it said there can be something here.
Despite the pomp and circumstance, the Liberals couldn't cover the rift that was developing. Who would control natural resources was still an issue. As the celebrations came to an end, so did Peggy and Balmer's summer. The harsh reality of publishing a newspaper in a northern community of less than 10,000 people took hold. With no staff, they split the work down the middle. Peggy would find the stories and take pictures for the front page. Balmer would write the editorials and print the paper.
My first assignment was the old Hudson Bay fort in the valley, abandoned the year before. Once the headquarters for the fur trade in Western Canada, I could sense ghosts at every turn.
The first paper came out the day before Christmas. Balmer hadn't eaten in days, but now all the restaurants were shut. He and Peggy would have to celebrate with a cup of tea. The paper was at last a reality, but generating revenue would be another matter. Cash flow was next to nothing. They would have to find additional sources of advertising. But again, they felt like strangers. The business community stuck with the bulletin.
Good morning.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good. What can I do for you?
Hello there. My name's just here to sell some advertising space for my new paper. And if you're
The experience raised the question of independence. Advertisers often demanded the paper be faithful to the party they supported.
we'll do it for 125.
Okay, and that includes the picture?
You can do a picture and text any size, whatever you want inside.
Not to be discouraged, in her column The Mirror, Peggy continued to reflect the many sides of the frontier community. Edmonton may have been at the end of the line, but had a sense of itself that rivaled Toronto. When Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous actress of her day, visited the city, Peggy decided to become an actress herself. She would try out for the lead role in the play The Tyranny of Tears, being presented by the local drama society. The play went on to win the Dominion Drama Festival in Winnipeg, and Peggy was named Best Actress. But the prospect of a career on the stage couldn't have come at a worse time.
Charles Cross, the principal investor in the Saturday News, convinced Balmer to open a daily newspaper, The Capital, to advance the policies of the government. I didn't like the idea from the beginning. What had happened to the idea of being independent journalists? The paper would be expected to reflect liberal policies, not the ideas of its editor.
Her husband had a more practical reading of the situation. Like it or not, the ability to raise investment would determine their future. Peggy's idealism would lead them to the poorhouse. Balmer steamed ahead on his own, spending the money on a new printing press and hiring 10 new employees to produce 2 papers. Peggy tried to safeguard the independence of the Saturday News, but the paper was quickly swamped by the demands of the daily capital.
To be honest, I identify more with Peggy than with Balmer, even though he had a very important role later on. She was one of the first members of a National Association of Women Journalists, and they organized, they knew one another, they helped one another. I don't think it's a coincidence that Alberta women got the vote first in the whole country, well ahead of Ontario, for example, because there was this atmosphere of opportunity for women.
The sinking of the Titanic came as a great shock. The month before, I had made lunch for one of the passengers, a newspaper editor from London, who had agreed to invest in the paper. It was the kind of investment we needed, an investment in journalism, not the bottom line that obsessed the local business community.
The Bulletin's coverage, especially, of new immigrants from Eastern Europe, the Ukrainians, and also the coverage of horrific coverage of Indigenous issues and people, but especially, the Bulletin advocated taking away Indigenous land and giving it to better men, meaning them. And those were the years when even the progressive papers really worked hard to promote eugenics and all kinds of things that we would find objectionable now.
Oliver was Superintendent General of Indian Affairs with the federal government in Ottawa. He utilized that power to confiscate the land that Treaty 8 had promised to the Papaschase First Nation south of the city. Peggy wrote that the land would never return to its rightful owners. First Nations were becoming outcasts on the territory that was rightfully theirs.
Anything of value is taken. There's a feeling that the place is empty and you can take anything you want, and there will always be enough, and if you use something up, you just move over the next hill and there's another promised land over there. But that same attitude of an endless land of bounty, there for the taking, put there by God. As de Tocqueville said, that this continent seems to have been prepared by Providence to be the home of a great nation.
My second film, Death of a Delta, explored how far the entitlement of a settler society could impose itself on the lives of Indigenous peoples. I traveled to Fort Chipewyan, Alberta's oldest community, threatened by a massive dam being built upstream on the Peace River. As multinational corporations took control of development in the north, the question of who owned the land returned. Water levels fell so drastically, local trappers had to use dog teams to launch their boats.
We just don't know just what we're going to do, and this is how long it's going to last. We don't know.
Electricity enough for the smelters, enough for the factories, enough for the pulp mills and the refineries.
Do we have to have a battle over it? Do we have to have an army go down and blast this dam? If there has to be another Louis Riel's rebellion, I think I'd be one of them.
It was an important lesson. Like Peggy and Balmer's newspapers, my films began to speak in the voice of people left behind by history.
I was reminded of the posters I'd seen in the railway stations on the journey west. 100 acres free land, next year country. No matter what hardships they faced, the newcomers never gave up their hopes for a new Jerusalem.
As the high-level bridge reached across the Saskatchewan River, Peggy hardly recognized the new Alberta that was taking shape. At the top of the agenda in the new legislature was the expansion of the railway system in the north, where the latent wealth of the tar sands had recently been discovered. But the haste of the government created a crisis. The American company they hired to finance the construction had no experience building in the swamps north of Edmonton. As the rails sank into the muskeg, cost overruns mounted until the laying of tracks slowed to a halt. The cabinet would have to convince the public to buy additional bonds to complete the line. But the railway scandal, as Balmer called it, was about to break on the front pages of both the Saturday News and the Capital.
The Capital proved to be our undoing. When Balmer refused to withdraw his coverage of the railway's predicament, the Liberals turned on him, threatening to withdraw their investment. I was reminded of the time he'd cautioned me in Brantford. Newspapers begin in the hands of people with great ideas, but shallow pockets. They end in the hands of men with deep pockets, but shallow ideas.
Charles Cross, the Attorney General, was not only the biggest investor in the paper, but the leader of the railway lobby. He and another prominent Liberal, Peace River Jim Cornwall, were not pleased with the paper's reporting that for 10 years the province would have to pay $370,000 per year to cover the interest on the bonds.
The figures were no mystery. They had been tabled in the legislature the previous day. But the idea that the government's own newspaper had drawn attention to them enraged Cross. Within hours, he had withdrawn his investment in the Saturday News and convinced the rest of the cabinet to follow suit.
Balmer now had to work day and night to keep the paper afloat. But as the scandal grew, the business community turned against him. Advertising disappeared, and the paper began to run out of money. Placing a padlock on the door of the paper, Cross announced Balmer was no longer the editor of the Capital. Then the same investors withdrew their money from the Saturday News. The life of Peggy and Balmer's first paper was over. Today, Peggy and Balmer's first attempts to establish independent newspapers can be found at the Provincial Archives in Edmonton. There was always Peggy's column, The Mirror, across the page from Balmer's editorials, making sure a woman's point of view would not be forgotten. I wanted to know where Peggy's stubborn pride had come from. Her family had migrated to America when Scotland was invaded by the English in the 17th century. Peggy could neither forgive nor forget. In one of the oldest European communities in America, I met a long-lost relative, Crosby Forbes. The Watts were part of the Forbes clan.
The lack of opportunity in Scotland is what drove them out. And the quantities of people who emigrated from Scotland is unbelievable.
Sometimes the big emigrant ships couldn't put into harbors maybe such as this one, so people were emigrating from some of the smaller places. They'd send a smaller boat to row in as close as they could, and sometimes it was a custom. The older folks would carry the younger folks on their backs because maybe they only had one good pair of shoes which would have to last them, so they wanted to protect the shoes, obviously, not begin a journey of a lifetime with a poor pair of shoes ruined by the sea. So the old folks would carry them out to these boats and be the last physical contact they'd have with their sons or, their brothers.
The very first printing press will establish itself in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, 1638, just 8 years or so after the planting of that colony. And it's establishing itself as an important source of information from the beginning. So even in that early era of initial settlement, getting the very foundations of towns, townships, structures of life established, one of the first things that comes through is a printing press in that first decade of settlement. Newspapers themselves do become contentious across the colonies. Massachusetts will print the first newspaper. It will print the first multi-page newspaper that will have a single run, and then it is axed by the royal governor, because it was not approved by the royal governor or parliament.
As United Empire loyalists, the family moved north to what remained of British America. But even Ontario was not their cup of tea. That Scottish spirit of independence would carry them all the way to Alberta. As the temperature dropped and they ran out of wood to heat the cabin, Balmer had to look for a job. He found one at the Edmonton Journal as an assistant editor. But Peggy would have none of it. Stepping out on her own, she started her own newspaper, the Independent Mirror. Furious with Balmer's betrayal by the Liberals, she wrote on the front page,
I swear men will have no place in the financing and production of this paper. Men's arrogance, men's inability to listen, men's need to control everything will have no place on these pages.
She moved out and published the paper from her kitchen. But within 6 months, she had run out of money. She and Balmer would have to reconcile. They now had 3 children to support. Soon she stopped even writing articles, opening an antique shop in her living room. Maybe there she could come to terms with the bankruptcy of the papers. Then, to her shock, her boy Frederick ran away from home to enlist in the First World War. Balmer wrote a poem about the memory of a father and son on the frontier. Little boy blue, come blow your horn and mount your steed this summer morn. Your hobby horse is a charger bold, it takes a strong little arm to hold. You take my hand, and from our street, familiar to your tiny feet, we pass along through foreign parts to where the dear green country starts. It's time for home, you cry no, no, but when we turn, our pace is slow, and ere we reach the beaten track, you're glad to climb upon my back. As the war intensified, Edmonton enlisted more men per capita than any city in Canada. It was to be a great adventure. Men believed the war would be over in a month. Families depended on the newspaper for news of their sons and husbands. The war was taking a terrible toll on the Alberta regiments. Once a week, Balmer published a letter from a soldier at the front. When the death toll exceeded 1 million men, Peggy discovered mothers who'd hidden their sons from the recruiters.
I expressed great sympathy for these women in my writing. But to question the war is considered an act of treason, punishable by prison. Newspapers are now at the total command of the government.
Her son had been wounded in a U-boat attack in the North Atlantic, but word came that he was recovering in a military hospital in England. There was nothing she could do. She hired a car to explore the hinterland of the province and write a book, including the work of a pioneer photographer, Ernest Brown. Like Peggy, Brown was a social activist who lobbied on behalf of the settler against the liberal establishment. The portraits he took were the perfect match for her articles describing the determination of the homesteader. Ernest Brown took a lot of pictures of newlyweds, each photograph the portrait of a dream. The names of the communities they founded speak for themselves. Grand Prairie, Blue Sky, Spring Coulee, Longview, Big Valley, Blackfoot Crossing. Brown's photographs documented the growth of the Western economy, the thriving communities that sprang up across the prairie. Most towns had an independent newspaper, published every week. The Nutcracker, the Rebel, the Eye-Opener, the Vindicator, the Buzzer. Each reported on local issues and challenged the politicians in Edmonton. Like Balmer had for so many years, independent publishers made use of new developments in technology like linotype to keep readers up to date with community life. Within months, Peggy bounced back, writing freelance articles for the Alberta Homestead, a paper she helped an organization called the United Farmers get off the ground. Peggy was now writing about the kind of grassroots political movement she had come west to be part of.
The United Farmers have banded together and use these pages to speak out on freight rates for the shipping and marketing of wheat. The war increased production, but favored monopolies like the Winnipeg Grain Exchange and the railways, who increasingly controlled the shipment of grain on the prairies.
Railroads were a de facto monopoly. In any given area, you're only going to have one railroad that you can deal with, and the railroads were politically immensely powerful. They would routinely, back in those days, routinely bribe state legislatures, like bribe the entire legislature, and railroads ran the place. And the railroads would discriminate against farmers. They would they would raise prices or lower prices as they saw fit. And so the populists proposed to nationalize the railroads. We don't nationalize anything in the U.S., but they proposed that in the 1890s, and they proposed to take the U.S. off the gold standard also. And this is, this was unthinkable. This was an obscenity to the sort of people that owned America at the time, that they would propose these radical sounding things.
Alberta has been willing to flirt with different ideas, still does, that sometimes seem crazy and sometimes they are, but sometimes they are not. Sometimes they're just seeing the world a little less encumbered by assumptions, I think. The frontier in Alberta is so visible. It's the landscape. Suddenly there are the Rockies on one side and this great prairie unfolding on the other. The word frontier, it just sort of comes into your mind or into your sensibility just by being in the landscape.
Peggy traveled across the province to attend the meetings of the women. Even though they couldn't vote in the upcoming election, the issues they identified, education and health care, would change the direction of Alberta politics.
The meetings were held in remote community halls far from the railway. The women would collect me from the train, tuck me under a buffalo robe to stay warm, and set out cross-country. I would often not get back to the city till late the next day.
The Farmers were soon the largest political organization in Alberta, capable of unseating the Liberals who had ruled the province since its creation. Among the farmers' leaders was Irene Paulby, the second woman to be appointed a cabinet minister in the British Commonwealth. Peggy met her during an election campaign, and the two women became friends for life. Peggy's camera was once again at her side as Irene barnstormed across the province. Politics had become fun again. A large part of populism was the Chautauqua movement, combining education with entertainment. As troops of actors toured the province, Peggy produced theatricals and some of Canada's first radio shows.
Badland Dress, English Final Mix.
In 1978, I worked on a film for the National Film Board West series every Saturday night. The film again explored the roots of populism on the prairies. Peggy would have loved the music, although it was a far cry from the Royal Conservatory. By 1921, the United Farmers of Alberta had elected its first government. One of the first things the party legislated was an end to prohibition. Balmer could stop carrying his bottle of scotch in a brown paper bag. Peggy could breathe a sigh of relief. Then the government set its sights on repatriating the province's natural resources. Unlike other provinces, Alberta's claim to oil and gas revenue had been refused by Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister. John Brownlee, the UFA Premier, traveled to Ottawa to negotiate the rights for the province. It would take 4 years, but finally in 1929, the titles were returned to their rightful owner. The farmers even appeared to have God on their side as they campaigned to return truth and the social gospel to politics.
The vision was building the New Jerusalem, and what they meant was building what is called in the Bible the kingdom of God, but building a society of justice and equality and freedom and well-being.
People built those churches themselves. Somebody would give up a corner of their quarter section for church land. The Greek for liturgy, liturgia, liturgy, actually means the work we do together. And so those churches, that would have been perhaps one of the first instances on the prairie of people's understanding of the work, the work they do together.
It's about the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized, the stranger in your midst. The kingdom of God isn't somewhere off. The kingdom of God is what we build here.
It was panic. 16.5 million shares of stock sold in a single day. Sold hopelessly, desperate, at any price.
Black Tuesday, the stock market crash that shook the world, had special significance for Alberta. Far from markets, staple products like wheat and oil were especially vulnerable. Investment became scarce in a cash-starved environment. Brownlee appealed to Albertans, but the fate of his government was tied to a declining economy. Then a severe drought descended on the prairies, the depression striking at the heart of the farmers' vision for the province. Banks foreclosed on mortgages, forcing men to the cities in search of work. The destitute gathered in Edmonton's Market Square, demanding action. They threatened to march on the Imperial Bank of Commerce down the street. When Brownlee called out the police, the fate of his government was sealed.
Farmers' relationship with banks is pretty antagonistic because farmers, they borrow all the time, and so they're very much at the mercy of bankers and of the money supply and of the currency. And so farmers were, they felt themselves to be uniquely screwed by bankers.
The heart of that financial system was New York, where journalists like Louis Lapham have documented how a failed democracy produced Donald Trump.
Money is boss, cash is king. And I, Trump, am an embodiment of that. I don't need myths, I do deals. He says, trust me because I am rich. The American people over the last 30 years have lost faith in the story of democracy. Democracy is seen as uncivil and unsafe, not effective in a world surrounded by terrorists and enemies of all kinds.
The world's first democracy took root here in 416 BC, but lasted only a century.
In ancient Greece, Periclean Greece, the rich men in the polis were expected, not obliged, but expected to give to the public spirit and the common good. They built temples, gave blessings to anybody who was a citizen of Athens. They get the idea of giving to the Commonwealth from Prometheus. As long as the rich put more emphasis on their store of virtue than on their hoard of wealth, they can be looked at with admiration, not with envy and resentment. But when they put too much emphasis on their hoards of wealth, that's when it slides toward plutocracy. When a society becomes diseased with plutocracy, the word in Greek is pleonexia, and that means the wish for more of everything.
What is wrong? Has the pursuit of money blinded your eyes? How many suits do you need? We love that big apple. Till we get that worm. You think that this is peace? This ain't peace. This is warfare.
Back in Alberta, religion was transforming politics. In the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute, an unknown preacher was fanning the flames of populist anger. The year was 1934.
This is the first broadcast of the Alberta Social Credit League over Canadian station CFCN, Voice of the Prairies. On behalf of the cause which we represent, we greet you. It is our purpose and aim to end poverty and distress in Alberta.
The speaker was William Eberhardt, a school teacher and preacher known as Bible Bill, the leader of a new Alberta party, Social Credit.
The social credit concept is not the product of the imagination.
Peggy had met Eberhardt 30 years before in Ontario. Swept off her feet by his contention the world was about to end in 1,000 days.
I wonder if I am wrong. Those of you who have investments or money or savings.
Many different religions and sects within religions are passionately convinced that the world will end in 1,000 days or next year or a couple of years, the Great Coming, or by the end of times and so forth. And it doesn't mean that they don't think that they're wrong. They don't think that they're misled. They don't think they're naive.
The more I am becoming more convinced.
Balmer couldn't believe what he was hearing. But Peggy's instincts told her that the strange man was about to assume a place on the stage of history.
We would ask you to bear in mind these words. The eyes of the world are on Alberta.
I just want to confirm, 10 a.m. in Stettler, then stopping for lunch in Big Valley, and then depending on the time, heading down to Rowley, and then ending up at Three Hills.
The newspapers turned against him from the beginning. The Calgary Herald imported a cartoonist from Los Angeles to make fun of Social Credit and its leader. His assignment was to compare Eberhard to Hitler and Mussolini. Balmer decided to track the insanity to its source. He caught up with Eberhard in central Alberta in the town of Big Valley.
Yes, this is your friend Eberhard. I am determined. It will take more than all the money these big shots can pour into this election. The most ridiculous cartoon some moron can conceive. It will take more than the most unscrupulous, lying, whispering campaigns the minds of depraved reprobates can devise. I am determined to bring home to the money powers whose stool-pigeoning lawyers are listening and making dictaphone records of what I say. This is Eberhard, telling the enemies of the people some cold, hard truth.
Social credit originated in the economic theories of Major C.H. Douglas, an English engineer who brought his ideas to Canada that the economic hard times could be solved by government increasing the money supply. Douglas's ideas had traveled around the world. From Scottish coal miners to Australian unions, he became the champion of the working man. Eberhard and the radical members of his cabinet saw the press as the enemy. To fight back against the criticism of his policies, the government would have to control the media. Down the street from the Journal was the Capitol Theatre. To keep abreast of the most recent developments in Europe, Balmer began to watch the newsreels it screened daily.
Der deutschen Armee einen Ruhmestitel erwerben. Den besitzt sie bereits, ihr braucht ihn nur, ihn zu bewahren.
The similarities to social credit were chilling. Alberta was becoming international news, the press gallery full of reporters from London, New York, and Washington. The arrival of fascism in America had become a lead story. Eberhard was hard at work in the Premier's office, writing new legislation to introduce in the House. One of the bills was intended to control the stories the press could print. Balmer never left the legislature grounds. He bought a portable typewriter to report on the sessions, which now stretched late into the night, every night. His editorials would confront Eberhard straight on.
Yesterday, a group of green shirts arrived from England. Thugs Douglas had sent to Edmonton to help coordinate the rallies. It seems their real job will be to intimidate those of us who still criticize the government. When I saw them, I immediately worried for our safety.
This was so blatant. I mean, because, the Press Act, we call it for short,
I mean, it allowed the government to demand corrections for things they didn't like, but it was more than that. The Press Act required that anything that the government wanted published, like a press release or a news story that government had written, that the paper had to publish it on demand.
Eberhard had good reason for the legislation he was introducing. As he toured the province after the election, he was shocked at the collapse of the economy. Where there had once been vibrant communities, ghost towns began to appear across the prairie. Again, he turned to the radio to reach his followers, devising a weekly series where a man from Mars asked questions about what had gone wrong. Foreclosures on local businesses were devastating to small communities.
I understand a bank is supposed to be a financial institution empowered by the government to circulate money. Instead, it hoards it.
But the banks doubled down on the foreclosures, leaving families with next to nothing, as the man from Mars observed, creating poverty in the midst of plenty.
The ruling class denounced this as insolence, as an uprising of the unfit, as the ordinary people trying to reach above their station and control things that were, that they had no business trying to control.
And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers.
Eberhard lashed out at the entire banking system. As the establishment consolidated control of the economy, the very survival of his government was now at stake.
But ye have made it a den of thieves.
A demagogue is a demagogue is a demagogue. So he tried to get around the newspapers by using new media, which was the radio, and he had his Bible hour. And he also felt that newspapers represented urban elites, and that he represented, and the listeners of his Bible hour were really poor people.
The lieutenant governor, appointed by Ottawa, ruled the press bill illegal. Eberhard countered by cutting off the water and electricity in Government House, the governor's official residence. The legislation would now go in front of the Supreme Court in Ottawa. It would be a critical decision for the future of newspapers in the province. Peggy and Balmer set out on a cross-Alberta tour to convince other publishers and editors to oppose the government. Balmer was now working around the clock, writing editorials defending the freedom of the press. When the Press Act was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, so was Eberhard's financial legislation to issue money to help the farmers. Peggy worried that his campaign to end the Depression was being blocked at every turn. Alberta was now the poorest province in Canada. Balmer's crusade against the government became so well known, the Pulitzer Foundation in New York awarded the Alberta newspapers, led by the Edmonton Journal, a Pulitzer citation. 35 years of Peggy and Balmer's struggle to protect the freedom of the press had at last been recognized.
Edmonton's the capital. Edmonton Journal was the major paper in the paper covering the government at the time. So you had somebody, an editor, dealing with these issues for a local paper, covering provincial matters that were really, really important for the public, and yet somebody there saying, we're going to deal with this, we're going to take this on, and having courage and having support to do that. So this was the Edmonton Journal making a decision to do that, independent of any sort of head office back in, Toronto or Winnipeg or whatever.
There was downstairs, I don't know, in the bottom of the building, there was a plaque on the wall. And I remembered sometimes on bad days, I will say, I used to go down and just touch it. Because It represented the kind of journalism that I respect. And on the bad days when things weren't going so well, I would say that is the kind of journalism I want to do.
The story has had to show enterprise, it has to show intelligence, it has to show an element of context and knows the context, and it has to show perseverance and skill set and knowledge base. And so when a Pulitzer is given out today, even in the United States, it's highly coveted because it reflects the very best and deep traditions of journalism.
By the end of his first term in office, Eberhardt's health began to fail. When the King and Queen visited the province in 1939, the Lieutenant Governor didn't even invite him on the royal tour. Although he'd never taken a drink in his life, he'd contracted cirrhosis of the liver from the anxiety of his work. He traveled to Vancouver to visit his daughter, but was admitted to hospital. I couldn't help but think of Peggy. The West she loved was about to disappear. The freedom of the press had been confirmed, but the court also ruled Eberhardt's financial legislation to help the farmers illegal. The banks would have their way. In the storm clouds that were gathering, Peggy could still hear the Premier's warning.
And overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold.
In one day in 2020, 26 Alberta newspapers, the same papers who had joined Balmer in defying Eberhardt, were shut down by Post Media in Toronto.
It gives me existential despair to be downtown now and see the Edmonton Journal building closed, vacant, derelict. I'm not even sure how many Edmontonians understand that nobody works in that building anymore, that there are a handful of reporters who work from home, who will never know the joy of working in a newsroom full of people arguing in amongst themselves, even in a newsroom, to get that diversity of voices and perspectives. We have lost something tremendous in this province.
We're locked in this kind of perpetual period of the zombie newspaper, where these hollowed out newspapers, a lot of them have been snapped up into large consolidated chains. So you still sort of feel like maybe you've got a newspaper, something comes out that has a masthead, or you can go to the website and it still looks like your local newspaper, but there's hardly anybody working there anymore.
When the Calgary Herald building was closed and sold to U-Haul, it's almost too on the nose as a metaphor.
Where there's fewer reporters covering events, covering government, covering policies, covering how politicians affect our lives.
Human beings often make a discovery or an invention that seems to offer wonderful things, but we're very bad at foreseeing the downsides of these things. A good bang can be useful, a better bang can blow up the world. Yeah. A classic progress trap, something that seems to be beneficial, and in fact is beneficial in the short term, but is catastrophic in the long term.
As the sun set on the western frontier, from Alberta to California, Peggy and Balmer couldn't imagine the forces that would change the world. The progress trap of concentration of ownership in the media became global. As the age of the independent newspaper disappeared, information would fall under the control of governments, corporations, and the deep pockets Peggy had always feared. It couldn't have come at a worse time. As climate change began to overheat the atmosphere, journalists would be needed to document the reasons why. The need to know the truth, to challenge those responsible, would become critical.
A capitalist economy has no interest in equality. The whole idea of capitalism is buy cheap and sell dear. It's relentless. I mean, that's the way it is. It's not an ideology, it's machinery. It's the way markets work. And there's, of course, no such thing as a free market. And a market is mindless. People would say we leave it to the decision of the market. The market has, the brains of a ball bearing. I mean, it doesn't know what it's doing. What it does is simply devour more.
Is it something about cycles of human experience or cycles of life where my generation forgets or doesn't care to remember how people fought to have public institutions that were quality institutions, that were for more than just the elite, that were for everybody?
Working with Lewis Lapham once again made me think of Peggy and Balmer, the responsibility of a journalist to ask the right questions. As global warming began to drastically change the Earth's climate, we needed to know what was happening. My generation would have to take up the fight before it was too late.
Within years, corporations like Exxon, BP, and Shell arrived to develop the tar sands. Multinationals with incomes larger than many countries. The mines are like feudal domains, with airstrips for the executive jets of the plutocrats, each nearly a nation unto itself, beyond the reach of the local community that once lived on the land.
In our particular part of the world is the tar sands, and what's happening there is beyond imagination. They're not hungry for oil, they're hungry for money. Traveling on the water tells you that something is going wrong. And you need to take notice of that. I'm endangering myself sometime. That's how I'm thinking, that being on a river. Because I know if I drink this water that my health is in jeopardy.
Not only the rivers were in danger. In the following years, all the world seemed to be on fire. Jasper, Fort McMurray, Lytton, Los Angeles. No community was safe from the flames. Jasper was one of Peggy's favorite frontier communities. She first traveled to the town in 1908 to report on the arrival of the railway.
Oh, I'm thinking it's a standard practice by industry that it doesn't surprise me. I've seen it for 40 years, first with detergents and then with acid rain, the power plants claiming that it was natural, that they didn't cause it, and more recently with climate, these paid deniers who claim that the climate is not changing, that if it is, it's all natural. And big tobacco, of course, is most famous of all for denying that lung cancer was caused by cigarette smoking. And eventually the science accumulates and they collapse.
You can just let capitalism rip and everyone will get rich and it'll all trickle down. And there's just no need to have governments messing about and regulating it. No need for these international agreements. That is the dangerous thing, because then you're going back to that old primitive free-for-all. Essentially, let it rip capitalism is the law of the jungle.
My personal view is that this is the last chance. It's not just late, it is the last chance, because over this next commitment period, over the next decade, that is the period when we have to see global emissions peak and then begin to decline. Once you get rid of that ice, melt it away, and you reveal a dark ocean, you capture 90% of the energy from the sun that hits the Earth in the far north, and you turn the north from a refrigerator into a heat generator. And that will change the climate of not only Europe, but Canada and the whole north, the whole northern hemisphere.
In my last film, Oil's Deep State, a province-wide movement of young people marched on the Alberta legislature. Time was running out to protect the environment their generation would inherit. On the same steps where Balmer had stood up to the government, thousands of men and women gathered to exercise the freedom of speech he had fought for. Peggy and Balmer retired the year I was born. I grew up hearing their stories of the frontier society they'd come west to build. As we walked beside the river, Peggy would describe the Paul Kane painting she'd first seen as an orphan girl in Toronto. She'd never forget the clear blue waters of the North Saskatchewan, flowing from the Continental Divide to Hudson Bay. When Peggy and Balmer died in 1963, we spread their ashes on the river below their home. It was long before we knew about climate change. Today, experts predict 90% of the glaciers at the river's headwaters will be gone by the end of the century. Peggy would have been the first to break the story, and Balmer would have made sure it was published.